So definitely my ultimate favorite hobby and way to relax and keep my hands busy is definitely my knitting. I've knitted through church services. I knit often in the evening while listening to an audiobook on my earphones and while sipping some tea. I knit while watching TVs. I think I've watched entire TV shows knitting the whole time. I really like to keep my hands busy. I don't like to just sit and watch TV. I usually like to have something else going on unless I'm just really tired. So knitting is something that I do while I watch TV or want to listen to an audiobook and that sort of thing. Lately, I've been knitting a lot of toddler hats. I have made a couple of adult hats in my past, but usually you need circular needles in order to make adult hats, and I do not like using circular needles. I fussed with that a little bit in high school and made a couple of adult hats, but I have not made very many adult hats at all. So if you ever got an adult hat of mine, that was a part of a rare collection, because I only made maybe 3 or 4 adult hats at all ever, and very quickly gave it up because it was very confusing to me. I have made several baby hats for different babies of friends and family members that's come along. I've made baby booties. I don't like to make the little booty socks because usually I would make them too big. But I do like making the hats. I've made quite a few baby hats. Recently I just made toddler hats. I hadn't ever attempted toddler hats, but it is pretty much the same thing as making a baby hat, only adding on some extra stitches. So I've made some toddler hats lately. These are the hats I've made. This one's my favorite. This is one of the few things that have come out the way I pictured it in my head. I used this polyester, I think, yarn, and sewed some pumpkins to the top of it. Usually whenever I'm knitting, I mess up my thing and then end up having to improvise, but the pumpkin hat actually turned out how I pictured it in my head. This one was an example of improvisation. I had intended it to just kind of be domed and then I have the bow on here, but I messed up casting off the top, so I got this little hook right here, so I put a jingle bell on it to make it a little more decorative. This is actually a present wrapping ribbon. I pulled the wires out of it and then sewed it onto this hat. This stitch is called the purl stitch. It's smooth on one side and really bumpy on the other side, and it tends to curl. Whenever I use it to knit scarves, all the edges like to curl over. Yeah, this is one's the purl stitch. I just know 3 stitches: the purl, the bamboo, and the knit stitch. This is an example of the bamboo stitch. There's this stitch that looks like bamboo, and then it looks like this on the other side. And I just sewed a pom-pom onto this hat. And then this one is an example of the knit stitch where it's kind of bumpy on both sides. And then I sewed a jingle bell on it. This is not my best sewing right here. I learned to sew while working with a friend of mine. We knitted green and red squares. I taught her how to knit, and then she taught me how to sew, and I sewed with her a little bit. She did most of the sewing. I did most of the knitting, she did most of the sewing. And then later on I attempted a quilt, and it really didn't go well. It was really loose and just kind of fell apart. And then I practiced. I was just trying to practice on smaller things. Like on St. Nicholas Day, I would make Christmas bags. If you don't know the story of St. Nicholas Day, which is December 5th or 6th, I'd recommend looking it up. It's a cute little story, but basically in Germany, one of the traditions on St. Nicholas Day is to have a Christmas bag full of goodies on St. Nicholas Day, which is either December 5th or 6th. So I would knit St. Nicholas Day bags, and then I would sew them which they were a pretty small sewing project because I just knit kind of a big square and then sew it so that it ended up like a bag. And I would also practice sewing on my little hats because I use the circular needles to make the hats. So I would have to knit the hat and then like sew it together at the end, since I wasn't using circular needles and was just using the straight needles. So I got better at my sewing, and eventually made my best friend a quilt and sewed it. It was functional sewing. It wasn't the prettiest sewing, but it is functional. So it was staying together and not falling apart, and appeared sturdy enough to be used. But it wasn't the prettiest sewing. So my sewing definitely still needs work. This one is another one of my little hats. Knitted is 100% polyester, I think, and put a pom-pom on it and a little button right here. That was really fun to make. All these little hats have been so fun to make. I really take a lot of relaxation knitting. I'll knit in the evening, sipping tea, listening to my audiobook on my phone, with my earphones in. I'll knit while watching TV shows. I think there's been a full TV series that I've just watched the whole time knitting, pretty much. Like I think there's been a couple of TV shows where I knitted probably 80 to 90% of the time watching it. So it's a really good thing to have if you like to keep your hands busy. I sometimes take my knitting with me to church, and when I'm in church service I'll knit. So it's a fun thing to have whenever you're somewhere that you're sitting and listening, but you're not really doing anything, and want to keep your hands busy. It's also really good boredom relief at things like doctor's offices and stuff. So I usually like to have a book or some knitting along with me at all times, so that I can kind of have something to do if I'm needing to wait for something a long time. So that's knitting tales for today.